afternoon, Utah. How's it going? All right. Let's give a big round of applause for all the speakers we had today. What an amazing day we've had so far. Great job. Thank you. I'm Kyle Turman. My pronouns are he or they, and I'm very excited to talk to you today. Very thankful for Ben and the front crew for having me out. And I have a little bit of a beef that I want to talk about. I have a beef with the word delight. Now, how many people have used the word delight in talking about building products, right? Yeah, probably a few. Yeah, we talk about it. It's probably more along the lines of something like this, right? That's kind of how we think about delight. Let's add a little pizzazz. Let's make it pop. I hear that a lot when talking about design, when talking about creating products that feel delightful. But oftentimes it feels like when we use that framing of delight, it kind of feels a little bit more like this, and it kind of falls apart. You can see examples of that like Sean talked about this morning, where maybe someone suggests a celebrity pops out of a logo. That could be delight, but it could be something else. I want to talk a little bit about how I learned to season my food. During the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, I wanted to learn how to be a better cook. I did like to cook, I do like to cook, but I wanted to get to a point where I could give someone a dish, and instead of saying, oh, this is good, to, oh, this is good, yeah, right? I wanted to figure out like, what are the secrets of making really better dishes? And one thing I learned as I was reading and trying a bunch of new recipes is that really good chefs don't just season their food once, right? They season it all the way through. And that really helps each level and each ingredient of whatever you're cooking really shine through in the dish that you're creating, right? Every single vegetable, every single meat, every single whatever can have a bit that brings together into a whole. And really, I think this is an interesting analogy for delight in the sense that salt is not something that you would just serve to somebody on a plate. I mean, you could, but they probably wouldn't love it. I do love some salt on a margarita glass, though. Who doesn't? I think that it's something that really extenuates the flavor of whatever it is that you are creating, right? It brings out that flavor, it deepens the flavor. And much like salt, delight can kind of be a little bit similar to that, right? Instead of just something that you toss in at the end, it can be something that brings out the thing that you're actually trying to create, makes it better. Because really at the end of the day, delight is kind of personality, right? It's something that lets you understand a little bit more about the thing that you're building or using or the thing that you're wanting to tell the world. I think there's a really interesting psychological study called the Bouba-Kiki effect. And I want to do a little bit of that study right now. This study shows these two shapes to people, and one is named Bouba and one is named Kiki. Now, I'm going to point to this one right here. What is that one named? And what is that one named? Okay, there you go. This study was conducted across multiple different languages, multiple different countries, and while it wasn't purely 100% accurate, it was mostly accurate that is definitely Kiki and that is definitely Bouba. I mean, we know that that's the case, right? And that gets into kind of these understandings that there's these underlying ways that we think about the world, right? Underlying ways that we translate things. I think Nancy actually talked about this really well in terms of how that actually goes into unconscious bias, right? There's a lot of ways that we think about the world that are in our subconscious, that are going at that multiple million times per minute, right? But the good parts about that is that we can understand how people think and how people think about the things that we're building to use that to differentiate the way that we build things between our competitors, right? And that's really where the business case comes in for a lot of this aspect of delight. It's not something we're just tossing in at the end. It's something we're strategically thinking about that helps us differentiate between our competitors. And that could be in a bunch of different ways. There's a lot of ways that can manifest. It could be this amazing app that Andy Allen built that allows you to mark to-dos off in a really cool way and celebrates that so you feel confident and you keep doing it. Or it could be this amazing perfumery based out of Paris that after you buy the perfume, it actually allows you to, excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. It actually allows you to put your name on the box and say, hey, this is mine. And they take a really amazing pen and draw your name as you buy that, right? And so really at the end of the day, delight could really just simply be creating moments of connection that make people feel. And so if we kind of change the perception and the way that we're thinking about delight, that gives us a different context in how we use it. So I want to talk about 2 case studies really quickly at a high level of how I've tried to do that before. One is at Dropbox, we had this new opportunity where there was a new Dropbox desktop app being made. There was also a brand refresh that maybe some of you have seen or heard about. It was a little bit controversial at the time. And people at Dropbox didn't really know how to use that brand in the product. They didn't really know how to make it a way of designing, not just something that we put on the marketing site. And so as we thought about this new design system that we were also building for this new product offering, the new desktop app, we thought about how we could integrate a lot of the things that the brand attributes were bringing into the marketing site into the design system and into the product as well. Sorry. So one thing that we did is we actually started kind of from scratch, and we said, what would be the wildest thing that we could create? What would be the most accentuated version of how we think about Dropbox brand and putting it into the product? And I think a lot of this could be done. We could have had multiple sessions where we pontificated for hours and drank cappuccinos and thought about the deepness of things. And maybe we did some of that as well. But we also wanted to start by making things. We wanted to start by making and understanding what worked, what didn't. And through that process, we started thinking about these 2 core attributes that the Dropbox brand wanted to express, which was inspiration and focus, right? We wanted to be able to inspire people to do their best work, and we also wanted to help them focus to do that deep work and get their work done. And so we started to map that throughout the flow, and we started to figure out maybe there's certain areas where that's accentuated further, maybe there's certain areas where it's kind of balanced, and it's kind of this spectrum of things, right? And then we started to understand that there's also certain moments that we could put in that allowed us to have certain elements that we were building in the product as well. And so as we started doing that, we started noticing not only is there this aspect of inspiration and focus, there's this aspect also of trustworthiness and playfulness. And so we were able to start to pair these things on these axes. Excuse me. We were able to put these things on an axis and start thinking about how these things could be expressed. And when we put these into 2 different kind of bigger categories of inspiration and focus, we were able to, we were able to start giving guidance and guidelines to people around how to use design decisions in specific ways that allowed us to say, hey, if you're designing something more for focus, maybe use less color, maybe have more white space, give a little bit more room for the content as well. Excuse me. If you're designing to inspire, then maybe you can use more color, you can use illustration, you can have a little bit more text. And this gave a little bit more options for people to understand how, understand how to make design decisions at scale. This allowed us to start to create a swath of options that when we launched the Dropbox desktop app, we were able to put in color in specific ways. We were able to have decisions that mapped across not only the desktop app, but also the mini player as well. And then that kind of changed over time. As we started to scale, as we started to learn more about how people were using things, there was actually kind of a pushback a little bit to where we scaled back even further to where maybe we're focusing more on the content And then we put more in the inspiration space towards the earlier stages, towards onboarding and things like that. And so things trying to change and you, excuse me, things kind of change as you go. And sometimes those frameworks that you develop, you kind of develop them at first and then they don't really always work out the way that you want them to. But as you start to have those conversations with people, what's important is being able to start understanding, how do people feel? How do you make people feel? I'm sorry about my voice. I'm okay, thank you though. So, let's talk about a different instance. That's kind of how you define delight. How do you build delight? That's kind of a different subject altogether. So when I joined Slack, Slack had a really amazing brand. And they had a pretty great understanding of certain values that their brand wanted to kind of represent. And you could see this in a lot of different ways, but when I was talking to Anna Picard, who was the head of brand marketing at the time, she framed it as a really helpful coworker. And that's kind of how the Slack brand kind of manifested at kind of a high level, right? And you can see this in the release notes that were created. You could see this in this little sticky note message that we put into the office. It was really kind of a way of helping people feel at home in the way that they were collaborating with their coworkers and creating kind of a digital HQ, so to speak, separate from their office. And then when we started thinking about this through the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, we really found that there was this huge surge of people who all kind of moved to Slack. They were all working from home. They were all trying to find that piece of connection. And so when we started working on this sign up and sign in experiences, this is where we really wanted to make people feel welcome. And there were a couple of things that we pulled out, things like courtesy and playfulness, but there was also this product principle called be a good host. And that's something that we kind of wanted to embody and be able to help people feel like they were coming into an office in the cloud with all their coworkers and feel welcome. And so there was a few things that as we created these illustrations and as we worked through the animations on these, we wanted to kind of make it to where it was introing very smoothly. You brought in that nice opacity and you kind of staggered things in to kind of create that aspect of communication and real-time collaboration. This went even further beyond just like design decisions. It also was around product decisions and how we actually created the product itself. When Huddles was released, before it was released when we were doing user testing, we found that people would often not leave a huddle. They would be a little bit confused on how to leave it, or they might accidentally toggle it and not know that they were inside of a huddle. So this is a pretty big UX problem to solve. But what was really cool is the team led by Ananice, who kind of thought about this not just from the aspect of, all right, this is an immediate problem to solve, but how can this be a moment where the Slack brand is accentuated? And what we did is that we actually, if you've used this before, maybe you know it, we kind of fade in a really nice jazzy elevator tune that helps kind of, let you know that you're on a call, you don't have it turned off. And that had an amazing response. People kind of from all over the internet really loved this, responded to it really well. And that was a moment that could have been just solved by maybe a banner, maybe this banner alone, maybe a beep or a boop, or someone saying, hey, you're on mute, you're on the huddle. But it was solved in a different way. And I think that's kind of an interesting experience to be able to put this moment as an accentuation of the brand rather than just solving this problem. So when we thought about adding video to Slack as well, we thought about what would be a Slack take for video chat. And there's a few words that we started talking about, like we brought in empathy, solidarity, playfulness, but we also thought about communal, fluid, celebratory. We were all working from home, and we were using other products that didn't really feel great. So we wanted to make something that felt a little bit more like us. We wanted to make something that celebrated those moments and brought people together. So one of the things that we did was we added this functionality that we called internally super reactions, and this is called effects. And this allowed people to kind of take over the screen with a few different pre-composed effects. And a challenge here was that we actually had to balance this with the video that was playing to make sure that your CPU and your GPU didn't run too hot, and did our best to make sure that these were really performant. So we worked with a motion designer and a design technologist in my team to be able to export from After Effects into Lottie. And then we ran it through an optimizer to bring all of these files down to most of them under 40 kilobytes. So through that process, we were actually able to still push pretty far, already pretty interactive experience, and still keep it very performant. As we started getting closer to the launch, we thought about what other details we could add to this to kind of add to the communal, fluid, celebratory space. And so we made a hit list of different micro interactions that we wanted to focus on, including kind of fading out the turning on and off of your video so people would feel more comfortable doing that if they wanted to. Opening and closing the chat, so that felt a little bit more fluid, like you were just a part of a conversation. And then also changing that background so that you could create kind of a vibe and experience for your chat. And all of these things seemed to resonate with the people that were using it when they launched it. This was an aspect of differentiation. Excuse me. An aspect of differentiation that people caught on to. And because of that, I think it had a lot better launch, a lot more understanding of why you would use this over another product. So when we get to the end of what have I learned in this process, first I've learned that I should have a cough drop before I come on stage. Thank you for your patience on that. One is to define delight for your team. Delight means a bunch of different things to a lot of people, and what's really important is to understand what it means for your brand and for your company. And then identify proper moments to accentuate that delight. Figure out the aspects that really would matter and use that as a way to dial that up, right? That salt that brings out that flavor in a specific moment that you want to dial in. And then realize that consistent investments pay off. Because you're doing that consistently, that allows that personality to really flourish. If you're just doing it one-off, people might not understand why you're doing it or what it means. So that consistency is really what matters. And I would say the last thing I would add in here is just have fun. I think there's a part of the work that we do that obviously we need to meet business metrics, we need to meet deadlines, but if we're having fun in the way that we're building our products, that comes through, and people notice it, and people care about it. And so those are the main things I've learned. And so I'll end with this quote that I think is mostly about how we interact with each other as people, but I think also is about kind of how we can build products too. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So make people feel the way you want them to with delight. Thank you very much.
Why are invigorated and focused on opposite poles?
Yeah, I think when we did that exploration, we kind of recognized both like these are moments that you could say like inspiration is something that is a little bit more collaborative. And there were times where you would collaborate with people in Dropbox, you would comment on a file, or you'd be sharing something. And those are moments that felt like a little bit more on the inspired side or the invigorated side versus focus and that deep focus work. You might have like a Dropbox paper doc open and you really want to just spend heads down time thinking about those things. So they're kind of on a separate spectrum because also that allows us to kind of design separate things in terms of the user experience that people are having with it. So that's kind of why they're on separate poles, but yeah, happy to dive deeper on that if whoever asked that question. It's a really fun topic to dive into.
Yeah. How did you realize you needed to define delight? Did people have different ideas about this within the organization?
Yes, exactly. I think that's why I think someone else had mentioned before, alignment is a big part of our work as designers and as leaders especially. Getting people to all use the same language, getting us to all use kind of the same understanding of what something is. Because, unlike Kiki and Booba, there are some words that everyone has a different opinion of, right? So it's in those moments where I had kind of that frustrated experience with delight that I wanted a further definition, and I found that to be very helpful in making it easier and quicker to make design decisions.
Cool. Let's see here. How do we discover or create a personality for our product in ways that don't feel forced or contrived, especially in an existing product that's never ventured far into the realm of true delight?
That's an excellent question. I think a really tempting thing to do is to look at other products and to be like, oh, I like that. I'm just gonna take some of that, right? That's why I think there's probably, half of the new websites that are made today kind of look like Linear's website a little bit too. It's a nice website, so why don't you take some of it? But I think that temptation kind of is what creates a little bit of that emptiness in the sense that it doesn't feel authentic all the time, right? And I think authenticity is something that people really notice when they're coming into your product and trying to understand and evaluate if they want to buy it. They want to align with their own values and the way that they think. And so that authenticness comes from you and your team, as well as what your customers need and what your customers are looking for, right? So if you're trying to focus a certain demographic, I know B2B is big in Utah, I'm hearing. That's a very different customer base than doing consumer, right? And so you might have a different definition of what delight means in a B2B system where maybe you're working with banks or you're working with other types of industries. So it's really kind of that understanding of who you are as a team, what that authentic representation is for you and your company, and then what your customers are looking for and how you can find that match, I think.
Cool. Having said that, question about the B2B, B&B, not that kind of B. If you're working on a legacy B2B product that is still lacking in accessibility and usability in several areas, do you think it's still appropriate to introduce delight?
Yeah, I think it depends on what, and this is why I don't like the word delight, right? Because it can mean so many things. I think really what we're saying when we say delight, right, is again, making people feel. And whether or not you intend it, people are gonna feel a certain way when they're using your software. Hopefully the feeling is not frustration. That's definitely not the feeling you want, right? And so if you can be intentional about those things and think deeply and say, all right, actually, I want someone to feel very trustworthy in this experience, then delight might feel a little different, right? It might feel a little bit more subtle. You might use different types of affordances in order to do that. And so it really depends on again, what your business is trying to do and who your customers are, but I think there's always room for delight in any experience, I would say.
Yeah. If you're, let's say, any insight on when elements of delight have not worked? I heard the confetti screen for Robinhood was really disliked.
Yes, definitely. I think we did some early tests. I'm laughing because we did some early tests on huddles like I showed before, where that dolphin animation actually had a dolphin sound that went with it. It was a little bit of like a, I think someone actually recorded that themselves too. And when we did some early tests in that, it found to be really distracting, right? And so there's definitely areas where you can push things too far and it becomes distracting, and it's similar to when you oversalt a dish, right? It's less about the dish at that point and it's more about the salt. So you have to understand how you're using it in a way that helps you achieve the things you're wanting to do, not just focus on delight itself.
Yeah. Around that same kind of vein of what's right for your business, how do you add delight into a really serious product? Maybe say data security, for instance.
Yeah, I think, so if you imagine data security and the people who are using data security, right? Like whatever the software is, like let's imagine a really intense data engineer, whatever, they're still a human being, right? At the end of the day. Nobody I've ever met in my entire life is 100% serious all the time. Obviously, there's moments where you need to be serious and you need to explain that this thing is trustworthy, and you need to do it in a way that makes sense for your customer and makes sense for your business. But I think there's also elements of that where delight in this instance could mean like, hey, I am helping you feel that this thing is working successfully. So maybe a delight is a little check mark that animates in and gives you extra confidence, right? Or maybe it is just the way that it's communicated to say, hey, your data is safe because of these reasons, and it gives you a little bit more explanation. Delight can mean a lot of things in that aspect because of what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. You've talked a lot about delight helping someone feel a certain way. When you're creating these experiences around feelings, how do you then tie that back to business value or competitive advantage? So take the scenario of Slack huddles and Zoom. Say my company uses Zoom all the time, but they want to consider Slack. How does delight play into the decision making of a business? Did you work with product and how that might be either a OKR, like a KPI of how you track the business value of the delight that you're building into it?
Yeah, I think, again, it's like this aspect of consistency. It's something you have to do consistently before really it becomes valuable. And it becomes a point of differentiation for someone to be able to say, I want to choose this over this. And it gives you an extra point. It's not going to be the only thing that works, right? Like if you have a great piece of software that is very delightful and feels very delightful to use, but it's not performant, it doesn't make sense for pricing wise for the business, it is really hard to use, there's not really a good case for it, for you to say, let's put all of our eggs in the delight basket. It's one of many pieces. And so as we started thinking about that, I think one lens you could use to do this is, we've used NPS to measure this in some ways. I think you can also use LTV, long-term value, when you start talking about building brand loyalty, and also brand salience is an aspect of that. Like how often do people think about your brand? These things all kind of can come into play, but they're usually a bit more longer term. And so it does require some risk. It does require some investment. And so that is definitely something to balance when I've had these conversations before where it's like, yeah, we could make this investment, but maybe we should do this other thing that's gonna help us, and that's okay too. So it's something you do have to fight for, you have to make a case for, and invest in kind of over the longer term.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Kyle. Thank you for the case study, and let's give Kyle another round of applause.